In this podcast, we pose questions like, can we translate human ethics into a series of numbers, the only language an AI understands? Or how does the Indian population census, the data underlying most of our country's decisions, conduct its process? Or what can a palliative care dog teach us about death? Or probably even the secret life of a content moderator at Facebook. Sounds interesting? Let me tell you more. Hello everyone. We are a group of content creators, graphic designers, animators and video makers who craft stories via new media, like a podcast. In today's episode, we are going to talk about autonomous vehicles or self-driving cars. More precisely, whether autonomous vehicles or self-driving cars can make ethical decisions. Decisions which only humans were capable of making till now. We have tried our best to dissect the problem and discuss it with various researchers who are examining these ethical dilemmas raised by autonomous cars. Before we get to that, let me give you a little insight of what we are getting into. Let's say you're sleeping behind in your new self-driving car, which is zooming past through the neighborhood to get you back home to your bed. But suddenly, two young kids jump in front of the car, rushing to get their ball. Now, if you freeze this moment for a while, you will know what we are talking about. The autonomous car can do two things here: drive through the young kids and risk their lives, or turn towards the right and hit at a nearby tree, risking the life of its customer, which is you. A human driver might react randomly, if she or he has the time to react at all. But the response of an autonomous vehicle would have to be programmed ahead of time. What do you think should we tell the car to do? This is a real-world version of a well-known ethical dilemma called the trolley problem. In the original philosophical scenario, a trolley is on a track heading towards 5 people. You can pull a lever to switch the trolley onto a different track, where just one person will be killed. It's a dilemma that explores the ethics of actively killing one person versus allowing several people to die. When it comes to self-driving cars, the decision could involve an autonomous vehicle determining whether to harm its passenger to spare the lives of 2 or more pedestrians, or vice versa. Most of the researchers view this as a real sticky problem. Adopting either strategy brings its own risks for manufacturers. A self-protective strategy risks public outreach, whereas a utilitarian strategy, which means protecting others, may scare consumers away. Today, we speak to Nicholas Evans about this. Nicholas Evans is a professor of philosophy at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, who teaches engineering ethics and studies the ethical dilemma posed by emerging technologies. Evans has been widely covered by leading news publications including Forbes and Quartz. A winner of the 2017 National Science Foundation grant, he analyzes the critical and complex life and death decisions that AIs might have to make. An article published by his university gives us an insight into his approach to the dilemma. He says, quote, "Although the technology of autonomous vehicle is new, the ethical dilemmas they pose are age-old, such as how to strike the balance between the rights of the individual and the welfare of the society. That's where the philosophers come into the equation. The first question we need to ask is, how do we value and how should we value lives? This is a really old problem in engineering ethics." Unquote. He further goes on to cite the cost-benefit analysis that Ford Motors performed back in the 1970s after engineers who designed the new Pinto realized that its rear-mounted gas tank increased the risk of fires in rear-end crashes. Ford executives concluded that redesigning the gas tanks would cost more than payouts in lawsuits, so the company did not change the gas tank design. But Evans has got a start to this problem. He said, understanding how computers think by sorting through thousands of possible scenarios and then rapidly discarding 99.99% of them to arrive at a solution, can help create better algorithms that maintain a fairness while also providing a high degree of self-protection. Evans offers an example of a self-driving car with a passenger on board approaching a school bus of 20 to 30 children. He says, quote, "A self-driving car approaching the school bus could be programmed to first discard all the options that would harm its own passenger, then sort through the remaining options to find the one that could cause the least harm to the school bus and its occupants." Unquote. Although it's not quite that simple, he says, but most people would agree that a minor injury to the autonomous vehicle's occupant is worth it to prevent serious injuries to 20 or 30 school children. It's a good starting point for looking at how much risk is acceptable and under what circumstances. There's little word from car manufacturers yet on how they plan to resolve the problem, but it is quite disquieting to think that a select few are actively shaping a public decision that will fundamentally change how we live. Without further ado, presenting to you, Nicholas Evans.
Thanks for being here, Nicholas. So before we start, let's just talk about the project you're working on right now. You have received a National Science Foundation grant to construct ethical answers to questions about autonomous vehicles. Could you tell us more about your program?
Yeah, so we applied for this. I applied for this when I started work at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, which is a big engineering college just outside of Boston. And so I had come from a medical school and I was interested in technology and health, but I was no longer working at a medical school, so I was trying to look for different technologies to think about in terms of health. And I met some colleagues of mine who were interested in autonomous vehicles, and we decided that one of the key questions in the ethics of autonomous vehicles is what decision-making looks like for an autonomous vehicle that's trying to make an ethical decision. So prior to this, we had many papers, as I'm sure you've read over the last few days, about how autonomous vehicles need to make ethical decisions, but no one really had an idea about what that looks like in terms of coding or machine design. And so that's why we decided to pitch this project. And then I wanted to take it a step further with some other colleagues of mine in Maryland and think about how you actually measure the outcomes of these ethical decisions.
Interesting. So what we are discussing here today is whether autonomous vehicles can make ethical decisions. We're going to first discuss risk-reward scenarios that could happen during an AI mishap. Now, this problem is very similar to the famous philosophical problem called the trolley problem. Just to bring everybody into context, I'm going to quickly tell everyone what the trolley problem is. It's basically a dilemma that explores the ethics of actively killing one person versus allowing several people to die. But what makes this something to think about here is that the response of an autonomous vehicle would have to be programmed ahead of time. So firstly, I wanted to know, how do we choose within each of these risk-reward scenarios? Like, does the general approach go about just reducing the number of casualties? Or is there a moral code we can all agree upon? If yes, then how do we come to a consensus? Or should we just let consumers make their own choices?
I think it would be a terrible idea to let consumers make their own choices. Or rather, I don't think it would be a terrible idea to let consumers make their own choices. I think it would be a terrible idea to let companies make choices on behalf of consumers and then tell them those are the only choices that are available, which is actually the more likely scenario. There are lots of different risk frameworks out there, but I think that a lot of us really have the differences between us are not as great as some people imagine, right? So most of us think, for example, that if you can help someone and it costs you very little to do so, then you should, right? This is a principle of charity that is common to secular humanism, to Christianity, to Islam, to Buddhism. And so we could think that in cases where there is a life on the line for an autonomous vehicle, say someone else's life and you're in the car, and all the car has to do is get its bumper a bit scratched, or maybe you chip some paint or something like that. I think most people would be hard-pressed to say that they shouldn't allow their car to have chipped paint or a scratched bumper or something like that. So the problem with the trolley problem is that it only measures one thing. So the key piece of ethics that the trolley problem is designed to think about is whether there is a moral difference between killing someone on purpose or merely allowing them to die. And that's one where actually people do disagree quite strongly. So sometimes we do agree that we have a limited duty to others, and sometimes we disagree, such as I am someone who thinks that allowing someone to die is the same as killing them, right? So if you're starving and I don't give you food, then I may as well have killed you myself, unless of course I had no food to give you, in which case there's nothing I could have done anyway. There are other people who think, for example, well, it would be bad if I killed someone, but I don't have an obligation to feed someone who is poor or help someone who is in crisis. That's where consensus needs to be generated, and that's where governments and regulators have a role, right? Because there may be some times when allowing someone to die is totally beyond the pale for a regulator or a government or a group of people, where it might be okay for an individual. So part of our project is to tease out which things we can kind of push away because we already know that most people agree with it anyway, and which things are really, really contentious and we actually have to develop deliberative processes to come to an agreement about what we should do.
You had in one of your interviews spoken about how we have to have a discussion as a society about not just how much risk we are willing to take, but who we are willing to expose to risk. In fact, the MIT Media Lab had famously crowdsourced a similar question with its website called The Moral Machine, where it gave different kinds of trolley problems to people, and more than 2 million people from some 200 countries participated in the study, logging more than 40 million decisions. And received some really fascinating insights. For example, players in southern countries were more likely to kill a fat person, a figure with a large stomach, and spare an athletic person, a figure that appeared mid-jog wearing shorts and a sweatband. Players in countries with high economic inequality, like Venezuela and Colombia, were more likely to spare a business executive, a figure with a suitcase, than a homeless person, a hunched figure with a hat, a beard, and patches on his clothes. In countries where the rule of law is particularly strong, like Japan or Germany, people were more likely to kill jaywalkers than lawful pedestrians. Most players spared women over men. Dogs were more likely to be spared than cats. In fact, dogs were more likely to be spared than criminals. How do you think we could deal with such vast cultural differences?
So there's three things here. One is that the MIT Moral Machine project, if you read closely into the study, I don't think that it doesn't measure what people think is ethical. It measures what people prefer, right? Yeah. Now, I prefer lots of things, right? Yeah. I prefer strawberry to chocolate, right? My wife prefers chocolate to strawberry. That's not a moral decision. It's just a preference. The other thing they did is, because it was a self-selecting sample, some really interesting results happened. So in their main paper in Nature, they had a big wheel which described all of the countries grouped by similar responses. And one of the things that we found is, in the Western Bloc, you had countries like Iraq and Afghanistan, whereas the UAE and other Middle Eastern countries were over in the Eastern Bloc, typically. Now, why might that be? Well, one reason might be that Iraqis and Afghanis have exactly the same preferences as Americans and Canadians. The other reason might be that the people they were actually getting, who had IP addresses or were located in Iraq and Afghanistan, were American service personnel inside military bases in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? So what the Moral Machine project has yet to do is really demonstrate cultural differences. Now, there's a really great issue of the journal Risk Analysis, which actually does start to do some of these like deep cultural analyses with, verifiable data about people's culture. So you're still right. And so then the two things we can say is, one is that vehicles are not yet sophisticated enough to tell the age of someone. So in some ways, this is a technical problem which is really interesting to philosophers, but much less interesting to engineers. So the engineers on my ground are like, why do we care about this? I can't tell who the age of a person is anyway in my car, or my car can't tell the age of a person. But these might be things where we leave this up to individual communities to make these decisions. Now, in case that sounds strange, just think when someone gets a liver transplant all over the world, there are international guidelines that have been created by the WHO, but they are usually implemented locally, right? So the precise reasons that you in India might be given a liver where someone else is not given a liver might be just a little bit different than the reasons that I in Boston would be given a liver rather than someone else, right? So these are what we call triage algorithms. And so I think that there's a place for the United Nations to set basic guidelines, maybe through the International Telecommunications Union or the UN offices at Geneva or the Sustainable Development Goals. But then each country will have to make laws on their own. And those laws are going to be very slightly different. And there are some times when I think that some of the ways that certain countries allocate organs are probably wrong. But by and large, there's this room for a reasonable disagreement between countries and between communities about what matters. The last thing that I would note is that the biggest cultural hurdle that autonomous vehicles have to surmount is not actually the people, but the quality of the roads. So 90% of car crashes happen in the developing in the developing world, in a variety of climates, and yet most autonomous vehicles are only tested in like California. I don't know about you, but living where I do in Boston, my roads are not the same as California roads. So there's a bigger question about how we program autonomous vehicles around culture.
There is an infrastructure problem that AVs are going to face. If AVs want to create any real impact on humanity, they will have to deal with this. This problem becomes really important because, like you said earlier, according to WHO, 93% of the world's fatalities on the roads occur in low and middle income countries. And below average infrastructure like unclear signage, poor road quality and indistinct lane markings are predominant here. Do you think AVs could be developed to use in countries without proper infrastructure?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that they can do there. So some middle-income countries may be able to get away with. So the big problem, taking a step back, the big problem is that the sensor packages, the hardware stack, is actually the most expensive part of the autonomous vehicle. Right now, it's like 3 times more expensive than the car itself. Right? So you could buy a $15,000 American brand new kind of sedan, and then the cost of the autonomous vehicle component is about $70,000 American, which I don't know about you, I can't afford that kind of car. But technologies become cheaper as they get older, but the problem with autonomous vehicle technologies is that the most optimistic number that people give for hardware is about $5,000, which is still an extra, I think, 15% on the average cost of a new car in America, much less anywhere else, right? So these are really expensive. Now, one way that countries, any country, including low and middle income countries, could attempt to circumvent this is by replacing some of the necessary sensors with infrastructure. So, Finland and Sweden, who are not middle-income countries, but nonetheless are known for strong government programs, they have a unique problem in that they get lots of blizzards, right? Because they're very cold. And what they're doing is they are geotagging the lanes in the roads so that instead of having to see in front of them, the cars can actually just ping the road as they drive, which saves them a whole bunch of sensor issues around whiteouts and optical sensor failures and even LiDAR failures. So you can imagine a country like Singapore or Malaysia, instead of trying to get everyone to buy really expensive cars, just make better highways that cheaper cars can be autonomous on, right? Because the technology to see those lane markers is much less than the cameras you need to drive optically. So this is something that individual countries are going to have to wrestle with. But by and large, the biggest barrier to the benefits of autonomous vehicles is always going to be their cost. And it's going to be the reliability of current cars, right? So current cars are very well designed. People drive their cars for 20, 30 years if they can get away with it. So no one's going to have a financial incentive to replace their car for an autonomous vehicle until the very last moment, which could drag out adoption of autonomous vehicles, some people say by up to 100 years.
Could you tell us a bit more about how geotagging works?
So one thing you can do for an autonomous vehicle, so autonomous vehicles have two main obstacles. They have to know what the road looks like so that they can drive on it, and then they have to know where all the other cars are in the road.
Yeah.
And then, probably pedestrians and other things, but those are like the two biggest problems, or the two first problems. So one way to solve the car-to-car problem is to, instead of making cars have to see each other with radar or LiDAR or cameras, is you give every car like a Bluetooth or a Wi-Fi transponder. And then instead of having to, or a GPS transponder, even better, instead of having to see a car, what the car can do is it can merely talk to all the other cars in the road, and they can tell them where they are in real time. It's much faster, it's much more efficient. In the same way, you can actually put these these transponders in the road, so that the road talks to the car, and the road tells the car, you are in lane 1, traveling northward, and you are going to need to turn in 100 meters, 10 degrees to the left. Instead of making the car do all the thinking itself, you just get everything else in the environment to tell the car what's going on.
Also, once AVs get widely adopted, do you think the costs would come down?
Yeah, so I think it will lower, but I think that there will be a flaw. My intuition, right? I'm not an economist. An economist might be able to say more. My intuition is that we are going to, at least for a while, reach a plateau where we can't lower the cost anymore. And the number that I've gotten for what that plateau looks like is still $5,000 for the hardware, right? Which is more than a new computer, more than some cars, right? And so until we can break that plateau, it's like the barrier to making smaller, more sophisticated smartphones was how we got the chips to be smaller, right? And so all smartphones were a certain size and a certain speed until we broke that barrier. So we're going to sit at that barrier for a while. Will it be 6 months? Will it be 5 years? No one knows.
This was a question we read over the internet. So let's say in an event where a car suddenly brakes after detecting an accident ahead, and let's say if the car was programmed along utilitarian lines, it might brake slowly so as to not cause the tailgater to crash, but this places more risk upfront on the car itself. On the other hand, a deontological car might say it might be really nice for you to protect the tailgater, but you don't have a duty to protect the tailgater. So lastly, whatever the solution we come up to here, our innermost underlying motives are going to be explicit when AI ethics comes into practice. Do you foresee any dangers here?
Right. So the way that I explain this is by talking about particular philosophers. I'll attempt to explain who these philosophers are to your audience. So one of the ways to solve part of this problem is again to notice that different people buy different size cars, they buy different kinds of cars already with some of these features in mind, right? So I don't know how common it is in your part of the world, but in my part of the world, people with children will often buy very large cars with like grills at the front to protect them. Those cars are not actually safer than other people's cars, but what they are well known for is killing pedestrians much better than other people's cars. So we already have some of this, and I think that the big thing the governments will have to do is kind of draw a circle around what's okay, right, within that circle and what's not, right? So right now, you're allowed to buy a very big, expensive off-road vehicle to drive on the city streets, even though it probably makes other people less safe. You probably aren't allowed to buy a tank. Now, again, I live in the United States of America, so sometimes these things seem possible in America. But generally, you aren't allowed to buy a tank. In the same way, you might be able to buy a utilitarian car, like a strictly utilitarian car. You might be able to buy a car that was designed with Immanuel Kant in mind, the founder of deontology. But you probably wouldn't be able to buy a car by Machiavelli, right, who wrote The Prince, or by Ayn Rand, who wrote the book The Virtue of Selfishness, right? Why? Because although, these thinkers may or may not be important, I tend to think may not, but, that's just me. It's not just that it's not whether they're important, it's whether these are behaviors we wish to allow as a society. So what we can do is we can draw like a circle around like the moral theories it's okay to have in your car, just like we draw a circle around the size of car that you're allowed to buy for operating on the roads.
Most of the countries that are piloting AVs right now are piloting their taxi or fleet services, right from Singapore to UK to Japan to Australia. Now, the owner of a robot car may reasonably expect that its property owes allegiance to the owner and should value his or her life more than unknown pedestrians and drivers. But a publicly owned automated vehicle might not have that obligation. Does it matter to ethics if a car is publicly owned? Do you think it would change the moral calculations?
Yeah, so I think that sometimes. We probably think that governments have certain things they can do that private people can't do, and governments have certain things they can't do that private people can do, right?
Yeah,
right. It might have an obligation to society as a whole, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the ways that you might think about this is maybe my car that I own privately, I will let it drive faster, right, for the purposes of getting me somewhere faster, even though it's worse for the environment because I burn fuel at a higher rate, right? But a fleet of publicly owned taxis, maybe we speed cap them, 1, for safety, and 2, for fuel economy, right? Because we don't want to be spending fuel just to get people there faster, but we also don't want to be changing environmental emissions above certain targets that governments should face. So these are the kinds of moral calculations where I, a private individual, am allowed to do certain things that a government is not allowed to do for certain types of reasons. Government vehicles might also be slower because it is worse, we might think, for the government to kill a pedestrian than it is for a private individual to kill someone in self-defense or in an accident or an emergency, right? And so we might think the government just has an obligation to just go slower than everyone else. We also probably think that governments have an obligation to a wider group of people, right? So if I buy my own autonomous car, right, I walk around, I'm not in a wheelchair, I'm not blind, I'm not deaf. And so maybe my vehicle doesn't need to be designed to be totally accessible because I don't need it to be totally accessible. But if you have a government-owned car, right, all of a sudden you have to take care of people with mobility issues, people who cannot hear or cannot see, people with small children, vulnerable, poor people, people with different health states. I mean, I think the government cars have an extra challenge from all the people they have to service, where I, as an individual, and a private company as a private company, don't have those obligations.
What about other things like a legal framework necessary for an autonomous vehicle? So a legal principle usually involves the idea that everything is permitted unless prohibited. That's to say, an act is allowed unless it's explicitly banned, because we presume that individuals should have as much liberty as possible. Now, this illustrates a potential break between ethics and law. For example, jaywalking and speeding are illegal, but they don't seem to be always unethical. So, even following the law could turn out to be dangerous here. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think that there's three big kind of points of attention here. One is that there are some laws that are unjust when we think about transportation. I think that jaywalking is actually a great example. So I'm not sure how familiar your listeners will be, but jaywalking was a law originally designed to protect cars, not protect people, right? So in the early days of automobiles, people were still just walking on the streets wherever they wanted because they hadn't ever dealt with automobiles. And rather than making automobiles go slower, they made being in the street illegal, right? So we have an opportunity now to think about whether or not that's a law that we still want to have, right? Maybe we either segregate our vehicles entirely, right? We put them in tunnels, for example, or we suspend them in overhead highways, or maybe we just say, you know what, every time a pedestrian wants to walk across the road, they have right of way. That makes engineers very frustrated, but maybe that's something we want to think about. The two big other points are when to let an autonomous vehicle go on the road and when to take it off the road, basically. In artificial intelligence, which is if an autonomous vehicle causes a crash, who is at fault? Is it the person in the car who didn't take control of it and stop it from making the crash? Is it the company who built the car? Is it the programmer who designed the car? There's no good answer, and so governments actually need to either come up with an answer, or my preference is to develop a system of insurance that obviates that problem, right? So many countries have universal healthcare these days, right, where the government takes up the risk for healthcare. I think that we are, with autonomous vehicles, going to approach a world in which government has to take up the risk of automobile accidents, right? So instead of each individual person buying insurance, the government insures the population for automobiles and for the potential harms that autonomous vehicles could face. But to do that, they're going to have to decide that that's a risk worth taking on behalf of society.
Lastly, all said and done, on the other hand, there are close to 1.35 million deaths happening every year due to road accidents. About 3 to 5% of India's GDP was invested in road accidents in 2018. Most countries invest 3% at least, in fact. AVs could save 90% of those deaths in no time, I presume. It could be saving a lot of money as well. So the numbers are clearly on the side of the AV. Any closing thoughts?
I'll leave you with this, and your listeners with this. So the first thing is it doesn't point towards AVs, it points towards reducing deaths, right? And AVs may be a way to reduce those deaths, but we also know that a number of things reduce road fatalities very, very fast, right? So here in America, the example that I give is Australia's road fatality rate, so per population, is 1/3 of America's. And that isn't because they have autonomous cars. So they have already solved 66-ish% of the problem without autonomous cars. How did they do this? They invested more money in roads, right? Because bad roads lead to more fatalities. They lowered their speed limits in certain areas. They more tightly enforced their speed limits. And they changed their education requirements for young drivers, right? So it takes more effort to become a driver. And you can do that in many cities in Australia, because even if you aren't a driver, you can still get around. And that's the last part, which is investing in transportation systems. So buses, rail, things like that. So I think that autonomous vehicles have a very important role to play, but like we, the people, don't have to wait for the technology to save us on the roads, right? We can tell our governments now what we want, right? And what we might want is we might want to be able to live closer to home so we don't have to drive as much. To work closer to home so we don't have to drive as much. I think with the current pandemic, everyone is getting used to working closer to home. We can demand better public transit, we can demand better roads, and we can demand safer roads. And we could do that tomorrow if we wanted. We don't have to wait for Elon Musk or someone like that to save us.